Hello and welcome to today's webinar from the DWI on long-term strategies for reducing lead exposure from drinking water. I'm Carmen Snowden and I'm here purely to facilitate the webinar and make sure everything today runs smoothly. And we are recording today's session, so a link will be sent to you at the end so you can share this more widely within your businesses. Before I go any further, I'd like to introduce the team who are actually delivering the content of today's session. So Milo, I'll come to you first, please.
Thank you, Carmen. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Milo Purcell. I'm Deputy Chief Inspector at the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and I've overall responsibility for this area of activity.
Thank you. And then from the WRC team, we have Mark.
Good afternoon, Mark Kowalski, Principal Consultant with the Water Research Centre and one of the technical leads for this project.
And Joe.
Hi, I'm Jo Hewlance. I'm a consultant engineer and I'm also one of the technical leads on this project.
And Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Fairhurst. I'm a consultant scientist at WRC and I will be talking primarily about the health impacts on this project.
Thank you. So we'll be kicking off the webinar with an overview from Milo of the before handing over to the WRC team, who will initially highlight the need to know facts about the research methods deployed. We'll take a quick breather with a mid-session poll to make sure everyone is awake, and also then the team will take you through the key findings which result in the headline conclusions of the study. We have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of this session. In fact, we should have around 45 minutes for that activity. And you should see a little questions box in the GoToWebinar software that we're using. So throughout the session, if you have a question, please do pop it in and send it over. I'll be monitoring these and at the end posing as many as I can to our lovely panel to answer for you. And it would be really helpful if you could include your company name when you send questions through, as we do have a mix of backgrounds to our audience today, and it will just help the panel to phrase their answers correctly. Now, before I hand over to Milo, I'd like to do a quick audience poll just to give our speakers a little insight into what you're hoping to achieve. So hopefully you can see on your screens a poll has come up now, asking you what you're most hoping to achieve from today's webinar. So if you could all please start voting. Excellent. I can see the votes coming in as we speak, and for the panels, the options that people can see are hear perspectives from a regulatory and policy context, identify clear headlines from the research project, hear about the methods applied to value, costs and benefits, or how to access research outputs and how can I use them. So the majority of our audience have now voted, and I can share the results. 58% of people, their primary goal is to hear perspectives from both the regulatory and policy context, and 29% identify clear headlines from the research project. So just to give an overview, we can keep things very high level, and that should give our audience most about what we need. So thank you very much for that, audience, and good to know that the poll technology is working there as well. Okay, so as a reminder, please send your questions through via the questions box, and we will address them all together in the second half of the webinar. So Milo, I'm going to hand over to you now for your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm very grateful for the numbers of people who have actually dialed in today. We have a very large number, and it's really very gratifying that there should be such a level of interest in this. So thank you for dialing in. The purpose of today is to share with you the outcome and the learning from a research project And I have to emphasize from the beginning that the document is a research report. It's intended, we hope, to help inform the development of policy and strategies for dealing with lead over the next 5 years and beyond. And it's important to note from the outset that it's not a strategy document or a statement of policy from DWI or from any of our other colleagues in the organizations that have collaborated in developing this. But it is, we think, a major step forward, because as many of you will know, that we've been on quite a journey on lead. I won't go into all the details, but suffice it to say that when I started working in the water sector, we were actually dealing with an advisory standard of 100 for lead. And over time, we're now at the stage where we've got a standard of 10. It's been quite a journey, and it's been controversial at times. And in some respects, it's been very frustrating for many of us as well. We're now at the stage where we've got the opportunity to put greater focus on what remains of the lead problem. And I think the emphasis at the moment is on lead as a public health issue. And things are moving on that on the international front. You will know that a number of international jurisdictions no longer consider that there is a safe level of lead. And there are references to that in the report and in other information. And you will also be aware that the Drinking Water Directive recast was adopted in December, but that because of Brexit, ministers in Cardiff and London will need to consider themselves how to take forward any engagement with the outcomes of the recast for both England and Wales, and in the devolved jurisdictions as well in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. I need to mention as well that there are a lot of assumptions made in the report, and these assumptions had to be made. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. We've had to make assumptions about things such as the standards, the approaches that might be adopted, the timescales, the pace of delivery, the priorities. It's very important to know that at this stage, these are assumptions. And there's a lot of discussion to be had around how we take these forward. So please don't see these as something that is being handed down as a roadmap to that is well defined to the delivery of dealing with the lead problem. We have a lot of talking to do, and these assumptions have been made with the explicit purpose of producing a report that will contribute to the debate and to explore options, to explore the costs and benefits. As I said, we have a very strong focus on public health, and we're very grateful for the input to the steering committee from Public Health England and Public Health Wales representatives. It was really very helpful indeed. And we also had input to the group from a practicing economist and from policy colleagues, which was also very useful. All of them were quite challenging in their own ways, and I'm sure that I really need to thank very much our colleagues from WRC for having the patience at times to put up with a lot of the challenges that came not only from DWI but also from our other colleagues. And I also need to acknowledge the help that we received from UCWIA in sharing work that they did previously. And I'd like to think that we built on that and that we're now actually helping to share back some of the developments we've made. You will hear that there are some differences in outcomes on between England and Wales, and this report deals with England and Wales. They appear occasionally, but I have to emphasize that these are marginal. They do not impact on current policy, and they don't really impact on policy going forward either. What is of much greater significance is the more granular differences within and between companies that we need to explore. These need to be investigated and scoped out as we move forward, and it's particularly relevant that we do so in the identification of priority areas where we focus the initial work. Preparatory investigations are planned for AMP7 in many companies in England and Wales, and there are also proposals now coming through in the Green Recovery Programme for pilot studies. And we very strongly welcome these, and some of them are going to be quite significant over the next few years, and we shall be helping those companies as much as possible. This work will further inform our knowledge base for the delivery of the significant programme of work that we anticipate will be needed in almost every company in England and Wales from 2025. Therefore, the planning for the provision of this work needs to be done now, so that we can be ready for its inclusion in the PR24 business plans. We need to start now. We're working with our fellow regulators in England and Wales and with policy colleagues to support these preparations. And there are different aspects to that. There's the practical, there's the supply chain, there's the investigative work. There are so many unknowns. We also need to explore the potential for investigative changes, and particularly with a view to the potential for adopting supply pipes. That's one aspect, and we hope that this report will actually act as a very useful document to support that work. In addition to that, we've got to do other things, and for DWI in particular, we need to engage with ministers and officials in Cardiff and in London on the development of ministerial expectations for PR24, and in particular what goes into the SPSs, the strategic policy statements. Those are very important. We have made a lot of progress, and we expect that large-scale led programs will be a feature of these SPSs. This work is a contribution to that debate, and I think I very strongly welcome it. I hope that you enjoy the presentations from WRC colleagues that are coming through, and we have a substantial period of time for questions and answers later. So perhaps I should end there and hand back to Carmen to progress the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Milo. Some good food for thought there. And as a reminder, please do, if you have questions, pose them via the software, and we'll pick them up collectively at the end with the full panel. So now I'm going to hand over to Mark and the team to take you through more details about the research that's been undertaken. So Mark, I'm handing over to yourself.
Thank you, thank you, Carmen. So to summarise the headlines of this research is quite challenging, but before we get into some detail, here are some takeaway thoughts from the WRC team. So the current approach to lead exposure mitigation will not enable the water sector to guarantee compliance with a revised water quality standard of 5 micrograms per litre or lower in all drinking water supplies. That much is clear. As well as the well-publicised benefits to childhood IQ, there are other significant health benefits of lead exposure reduction. The evidence is compelling for improved health outcomes relating to both chronic kidney disease, CKD, and cardiovascular disease, CVD. In England, lead service pipe replacement is found to be cost beneficial overall for water supply zones at high risk of non-compliance, and we'll come to what that means in a moment, is cost neutral overall for all other zones. And to maximise cost effectiveness, we believe should be completed up to the kitchen tap or the compliance point. For Wales, we found that lead service pipe replacement is cost neutral or better for all high risk zones taken together, and cost neutral overall for other zones, but only if it is assumed that lead pipe replacement results in the lead and water concentration reducing to below the current level of detection. And again, we believe that lead pipe replacement should be completed up to the kitchen tap to ensure the maximum benefits can be gained. So those are the headlines. How did we arrive at those conclusions? Well, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Jo.
Thank you, Mark. So I'd like to start by setting our project into the context of the objectives set out by the DWI. The aim of the study was to gather evidence and then examine long-term strategies to reduce exposure to lead in drinking water, which would ultimately aid future policy decisions. We had a number of objectives, as listed here, which nicely step through the overarching process we followed. We started by collecting evidence, established the scale of the issue, and also the part that current upstream dosing practices play in controlling lead risk. We looked at a range of ways that lead in water could be addressed and the available evidence for valuing the costs and also, crucially, the benefits to human health that could be achieved. We defined a set of policy options that incorporated practical and achievable strategies for meeting a lower lead standard, and then undertook economic modelling at a national England and Wales level. There's a rich body of evidence that we've drawn upon in this study, both nationally and internationally. The key research I wanted to draw your attention to is a cost-benefit study undertaken by WRC for DETA in 1997, as well as key UK well research, including the Plumbo solvency tool developed in 2012. Providing the necessary evidence for policymakers is complex. There was a number of different components needing to be considered and brought together. The main consideration is the public, those individuals that would be at risk of consuming lead from their drinking water. Who will be affected and how? What are the main sources of lead exposure and how can they be mitigated? Who or what are the drivers for change? What economic methods should be used and how? And finally, what other information or data is needed? In this first part of our presentation, Mark, Robert and I will be giving you an overview of how we pulled these various pieces of the puzzle together. And this is going to be very light touch as we have limited time, but the project report does contain much more detail. And I'll hand you back to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Jo. So in developing a framework for economic valuation, WRC worked closely with DWI and DEFRA policy to agree a suitable working definition of alternative policy objectives and translated those into high-level implementation options, which would allow us to value the costs and benefits over a 60-year horizon, commencing 2020. So we set the baseline year for all policy options at the beginning of AMP8, April 2025, and all policy options were evaluated against a reference scenario, which is, broadly speaking, the status quo or do nothing more scenario. On the basis of the discussions in Europe regarding recasting of the Drinking Water Directive on lead, following the scientific opinions of the World Health Organization and the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, we sought to quantify the impact of reducing the maximum permissible concentration of lead from 10 micrograms per litre to 5 micrograms per litre by no later than the 1st of April 2040, and of implementing a policy to require that there be no detectable lead in drinking water by some future date, which we've modelled here as on or before the 1st of April 2060. So before we could value different policy options, we had to be clear on the practical options available. And we've listed those that we've considered here. In completing this review, we did two things. We evaluated the strength of evidence available to quantify costs and benefits, including the degree of certainty around the maintenance of those benefits following implementation that can be achieved over the medium and longer term. We also considered the feasibility of deployment of each measure to achieve the policy objectives within the time frame proposed. We discussed the evidence available with the DEFRA and DWI project team. We found, for example, that the evidence for point of use filtration was mixed and the benefits not guaranteed for the long term, since consumers would be expected in this scenario to maintain these devices, these filters, in perpetuity if no further action to reduce lead was taken. Flushing practices would also have to be maintained and are not readily compatible with reducing per capita consumption over time. We also considered the potential for additional measures on optimising plumber solvency control, including further pH adjustment and orthophosphate dosing regimes, particularly adjusting on a seasonal basis. However, most zones are already dosed, and most are already dosing at least 1 milligram per litre, many at 1.5 milligram per litre, and a few at 2 milligrams per litre phosphorus. Our research tells us that the efficacy of dosing phosphate diminishes at concentrations above 1.5 milligrams per litre, and dosing at much more than 2 milligrams per litre is most likely a waste of a precious resource. In short, whilst small gains could theoretically be made in some areas, the team felt the evidence was not strong enough to guarantee compliance with the 5 microgram per litre standard. So this left us with lead pipe remediation. Now, there is sufficient evidence to confirm that the replacement of the lead communication pipe on its own does not mitigate exposure to lead from the remaining lead service pipe. The evidence for the long-term benefit of lining solutions over a 60-year horizon is simply not there, and heavily dependent, as always, on the quality of workmanship. And so the team is left with the conclusion that the only feasible and enduring way to guarantee compliance with a 5 microgram per litre or lower standard for lead in drinking water is to remove the lead service pipe. In this study, we've considered the impact of removal both to the property wall, a physically easier job to complete, but also removal of the service pipe and internal plumbing up to the compliance point, which is usually the kitchen tap. A third option, to additionally remove all internal plumbing which might include lead, was rejected on the grounds of being overly disruptive and very much more expensive and time-consuming for consumers. So in terms of the policy timeline, we were guided by the DEFRA team to assess various options against the reference scenario of existing plumber solvency control measures and communication pipe replacement. And this is shown here in blue. We assumed that all options followed the reference scenario until 2025, at which point service pipe replacement would begin in the high-risk water supply zones for a maximum period of 15 years. At that point, all high-risk zones were modelled to have been remediated, and the policy to replace service pipes in medium and low-risk zones could start, with remediation in these zones to be completed by the 1st of April 2060 at the latest. An alternative suite of scenarios were modelled which increased the pace of implementation in the high-risk zones to be completed in 10 years, followed by varying periods of implementation as shown for all other zones. So before we go into the components in detail, just a quick word about the economic analysis. So in consultation with DEFRA's own economists over the lifetime of this project, we used the principle of materiality to restrict our analysis to the items you see here. As is standard practice, all costs and benefits were measured with reference to the current situation, which we've called the reference scenario, and again, more of that in a moment. We are aware that there are other costs and benefits that could be valued, but either these were relatively insignificant or so highly uncertain as to add considerable noise to the results that rendered their inclusion meaningless. So included on the cost side, we have the cost of lead service pipe remediation, in this case replacement, and the embodied carbon cost of the new polyethylene pipe. And the main elements on the benefits side, we have the avoided adverse health effects. We have avoided costs of upstream conditioning. We have the cost of water saved from reduced leakage following replacement of the service pipe. And we have the lead scrappage value. And where appropriate, we've included the operational and embodied carbon costs that go along with those. So I'm going to hand over to Jo now to talk about the reference scenario.
Thank you, Mark. So the reference scenario is broadly equivalent to what water companies were doing during AMP6 to ensure compliance with the 10 micrograms per litre standard. We defined this reference case following a review of the guidance provided by the DWI and the lead policies published by each of the water companies in England and Wales. Under the reference scenario, it is assumed that P dosing continues at the current levels with almost complete coverage, and that conventional sources of phosphate continue to be used. Water companies continue to replace the lead communication pipe, either as a result of a sample failure or when they are found to be lead. And companies will continue to provide advice to vulnerable customers such as schools and hospitals. We're aware that this definition doesn't fit all companies, and that during AMP6, some companies did have a more proactive policy, and that some changes have been put in place for AMP7. However, this description does hold true for the majority of companies. So this definition of carry on before needs to be described in terms of the current water lead exposure risk to consumers, or in economic terms, what is the baseline performance? In 2017, the DWI reported that 0.6% of compliance samples failed to meet the 10 microgram per litre standard. This is a remarkable achievement, particularly compared to where the industry was in previous AMPs and certainly at privatisation. However, 4 companies reported 99 percentile maximum values above the standard, and 17 companies would have failed a much more stringent threshold of 5 micrograms per litre. Okay. One of the fundamental principles we have used in the economic modelling is the risk of lead exposure from drinking water. Earlier, Mark explained how we modelled the rollout of the policy options by high, medium or low risk zones. And I'd just like to explain what that means. We defined risk using a number of key factors identified through our own research and by using data supplied by a number of companies that supported this project. A specific request was made to 6 water companies by the DWI on our behalf. Our intention was to obtain detailed operational and performance data to supplement our research work. We took a sampled approach to data collection, focusing our attention on those companies that represented the best mix of water characteristics, size and location. These graphs here illustrate the range of lead sample results and P concentrations recorded by the 6 companies between 2015 and 2018, matching the AMP period used to define our reference scenario. The third graph shows the spread of lead pipe prevalence per zone, calculated by WRC using ONS property data. Because these factors reflect the likely exposure from lead in water, and because they can be universally measured, we use them to assign a risk score for each water supply zone. Each of the factors were divided into high, medium or low bands, as described below these graphs. We then defined a set of rules for assessing a baseline compliance risk score using these bands, as illustrated in this flow chart, and a score was derived for each supply zone. I'm not going to go through this graph in detail as it is available in the report. These zonal based risk scores were then scaled up to national levels. One of the benefits we have assumed for lead pipe removal is the avoided cost of upstream conditioning, the assumption being that this will no longer be required once all lead pipes have been removed in a zone. In order to model this, we created a set of P dosing profiles that set out the concentration of P per year. We've taken a cautious approach to these profiles by assuming a gradual stepwise reduction in P so as to avoid any detrimental impacts to water quality in a zone. An example profile is shown here for a high risk zone where the lead pipe up to the compliance point is removed. The P dose is held steady at either the high, medium or low concentration band until 2040, by which time all the lead pipes have been removed. The lowering of the lead standard is being driven by the need to protect human health, and as we are specifically focusing on waterborne lead, we need to quantify the lead in the water and then define how to use that to assess health impacts. In order to do this, we referred back to approaches that have already been used, specifically the 1997 CBA study I mentioned earlier, and more recently in Canada. The 1997 study estimated the average consumer exposure at a supply zone level using RDT compliance sample data. They derived a set of lead concentration profiles, i.e. the frequency of samples by lead concentration bands, and then applied these to populations in order to determine the proportion of consumers likely to be exposed to each water lead concentration. We used the same approach in this project, where we took the sample data from our 6 water companies and used it to derive lead exposure profiles for each of our baseline risk groups, so high, medium and low risk zones, which we then scaled to each nation. In this next slide, we have the water lead exposure profiles for England and Wales, which represent the baseline water lead exposure risk before any policy is implemented, i.e. to how much lead are consumers currently likely to be exposed to from their drinking water. Obviously, in order to assess the benefits of implementing a policy to reduce lead in water, it was necessary to derive similar profiles for after the policy had been implemented. The profiles shown in this slide are for a conservative situation following the replacement of the lead service pipes to the compliance point, nominally the kitchen tap. These profiles are based on evidence that we have collected during numerous small-scale trials. As such, they don't necessarily reflect the outcome that could be achieved during a major rollout of a lead pipe replacement programme. So a further set of national profiles were created, representing a more optimistic situation, whereby no detectable level of lead is assumed following the removal of the lead pipe to the compliance point. So armed with this suite of exposure profiles, we were able to quantify the impacts to human health. And I'll now hand you over to Robert, who will explain this further. Thank you.
Robert, you should have control now. Lovely, we can see your screen, right. Thanks.
Thanks, Jo. So biokinetic models translate lead concentrations found in environmental sources to a blood lead level, commonly referred to as a BLL. The uptake of lead by the human body is a function of age. As a result, 2 different biokinetic models were used in this project, one for infants and children up to age 11 and a different one for adults. The Integrated Exposure Uptake Biokinetic Model, or IEUBK for short, was used for children. This was originally developed by the US Environmental Protection Agency back in 1985. The model has undergone several external reviews and is possibly the most trusted biokinetic model for lead exposure. The latest version has been used by agencies such as DEFRA and EFSA, in addition to the US EPA. Fewer biokinetic models exist for adults due to the historical focus on lead exposure in children. This study utilised the Carlisle and Wade model for adults, and this model has also been favoured recently by DEFRA and EFSA. Key differences between the two models is that the Carlisle and Wade model doesn't consider lead exposure from indoor dust, such as that from lead paint. This, along with the lower uptake of lead by adults, results in much lower blood lead levels being predicted for adults relative to children, as you can see in the graph. You'll also notice that the blood lead is dominated by exposure to dust and soil, with water lead being a very minor component. However, the results of this project demonstrate that even changes to this small component through policies to reduce lead in drinking water can have a dramatic impact on the health of the population as a whole. The output of the biokinetic models are used to determine the blood lead level of the population over time under different policy scenarios. 4 different health impacts were considered, each of which has a health endpoint which we can measure using data for the population of England and Wales as a whole. Dose-response relationships, extracted from experimental studies, were then used to determine the change in the number of health endpoints. The choice of dose-response relationship and the health endpoints used were developed following a comprehensive review of the academic literature in consultation with specialist health economists, and have been reviewed both internally by our toxicology team as well as externally by Public Health England and Wales. As seen on the slide, the 4 health effects were IQ detriment in children, which had the endpoint of the decrease in IQ by age 10, chronic kidney disease, or CKD, as measured by the number of adults transitioning to stage 3 or worse, hypertension, as measured by the number of adults with a systolic blood pressure of at least 140 milliliters of mercury, and finally the presence of cardiovascular disease, as measured by the change in adult life expectancy. In order to accommodate the more comprehensive analysis of health benefits in this project, it was required to develop a bespoke health module, which was used to feed into the cost-benefit calculator tool. The data required to run this model is shown in this table. The module takes as inputs the blood lead levels predicted by the biokinetic models for different lead in water concentrations, and the lead concentration profiles before and after policy implementation. It then uses the dose-response functions and population demographics to calculate the change in each of the health endpoints for the entire population. The economic submodule then calculates the net economic benefit of each scenario relative to the baseline by considering both the effects of mortality and quality of life. The health valuations were found to be highly sensitive both to the choice of dose-response function and to the lead and water distributions. As such, the module was run both for the optimistic and conservative scenarios for the effectiveness of policy on water lead, and any uncertainty in the dose-response relationships were captured in an uncertainty envelope on the monetized health benefits. I'll now pass back to Carmen for a mid-session poll before we explore the results in more detail.
Lovely, thank you. So we've taken you through the methodology, trying to summarize, I think it's the best part of 3 years worth of research. And so I'd just like to test with the audience whether or not that overview of methods that we've provided has sort of given you confidence in the research results that we'll present in a moment. Obviously, I'm sure you appreciate it is difficult to summarize quite so much research with input from many different parties into a 20-minute summary. Okay, so I can see our results coming in, and the majority of the audience are happy. They're saying yes, that they've the overview of methods gives confidence, and about a third, just over a third of the audience are saying they'd like to see the full report to help them decide. But that probably reflects the nature of our mixed audience today. Lovely, thank you very much. So now we are going back over to Mark. Mark, do you have the option to share your screen?
Not yet.
You are the presenter.
Do you have that option now, Mark?
Yes.
Yep, perfect, thank you. That's lovely, thanks.
Okay, so in this section of the presentation, I'm going to take you through the key results in a little more detail for each of the nations of England and Wales. As the baseline in terms of lead and water concentration profiles and demographics are different, it's no surprise that the results are different for each nation. Because there is uncertainty in the reduction in lead and water concentration from lead service pipe replacement, we have valued the costs and benefits using two sets of lead and water profiles, as Joe showed you earlier and as Robert just mentioned. So I'm going to present two sets of results for each nation, one conservative view and one optimistic view, and then summarise those by showing you our best estimate, which is the midpoint between those two perspectives. So starting with England and the conservative view of lead in water reduction following lead pipe replacement. So here we have the four main lead pipe replacement scenarios for the high risk zones only, plotted as bar charts. So the top two relate to the lead service pipe replacement to the kitchen tap, the internal compliance point. The bottom two, lead service pipe replacement as far as the property wall. And the figures in brackets after the name of the scenario, these relate to the start and end years of implementation. All charts are represented as net present values to the nation as a whole, including direct costs, carbon cost, and health benefits. And as NPV calculations include the effect of discounting future costs and benefits according to HM Treasury guidance. So you'll notice the zero line here is in the middle of the plot, just here. And the value you can see there is 0. The costs are plotted as negative numbers, so bars going to the left of the 0 line, and benefits as positive numbers, bars going to the right. The value in bold above each bar chart is the net result in billions of pounds. So a negative number indicates the policy option costs more than the estimated benefits it brings, and a positive number indicates the policy benefits outweigh the costs of implementation. So in this case, where we're looking at the conservative estimate of lead and water reduction due to pipe replacement, we can see that the central estimate of costs for removing lead services in all high risk zones outweighs the central estimate of benefits by around 12%. However, we've yet to take account of the optimistic view of lead and water reduction to form a more balanced view overall. More of that in a moment. Now, these charts also show the relative contribution to the benefits of different health outcomes. So in terms of IQ, lifetime earnings, and avoided disability, they are shown in the orange colours. Health benefits to chronic kidney disease, CKD, shown in green. Health benefits to cardiovascular disease, CVD, shown in sky blue and red, although the sky blue portion is barely visible, it is there. Followed by leakage savings from lead pipe replacement in purple colour, and the avoided cost of plumber solvency control measures, expressed here as a net benefit in yellow. And one of the most surprising findings to us is the relative contribution of the health benefits from chronic kidney disease. Now, we expected to see a benefit to the population affected by cardiovascular disease because so many people in the population suffer from hypertension and related conditions. But we did not expect to see a more significant benefit to the health outcomes of chronic kidney disease, since a smaller population suffers with late-stage CKD. However, we can say here that the benefits of lead reduction to CKD health outcomes are second only to the IQ-related outcomes in terms of value. So on this slide, we show the results for England, again for high-risk zones, for the optimistic remediation outcome. So by contrast to the previous slide, you can see here that we are projecting that all policy options are cost beneficial under this assumption, with the replacement to the kitchen tap, as are the top two bars, being considerably more cost beneficial than replacement up to the property wall. Now looking at the results for all zones together, that is including high, medium and low risk zones, we can see that all options in the conservative remediation outcome scenario are not cost beneficial. And again, looking at the equivalent for all zone results for the optimistic remediation outcome, you can see that all options are cost beneficial, although notice there remains a marked uplift in cost benefit when we consider replacement to the kitchen tap relative to replacement to the property wall. Now let's look at the equivalent analysis for Wales. Again, we'll start with the high risk zones in Wales and the conservative remediation outcome. And you can see here that all the options under this assumption are not cost beneficial, roughly 20% more costs than benefits under this assumption. And there's an important point here that the costs outweigh the benefits more in Wales than in England as a direct result of the baseline distribution of lead in Wales is already lower than that in England. So there is less to travel to reach the lower standard for lead. But when we look at the optimistic remediation outcome for high-risk zones in Wales, all options are cost beneficial, albeit only marginally under the replacement to the property wall scenario. And again, looking at all zones in Wales as a whole, under the conservative scenario remediation outcome, benefits accrued are considerably lower than costs. And under the optimistic remediation outcome, policies which involve replacement to the kitchen tap are at least cost neutral or marginally cost beneficial. We contrast that with policies which replace only up to the property wall, which are overall not cost beneficial under either the conservative or optimistic remediation outcome in Wales. So, as well as considering both optimistic and conservative views of lead and water reduction, we also looked at the implication of the other major sources of uncertainty for both costs and benefits. And by way of example, I'm going to show you the graph for England again for the optimistic view of lead and water reduction. I'm going to show you the magnitude of uncertainties in the cost and benefits instead. So I've switched off the component view, and so this time each bar is plotted either in lilac for options relating to replacement to the kitchen tap, or pale blue for replacement to the property wall. Now, in common with other scenarios, the biggest sources of uncertainty come from, on the cost side, the unit cost of lead service pipe replacement, which is estimated at plus or minus 25%, and that's from the variation from business plan data and other project data that we hold. The variation on the benefit side, dose response relationships for chronic kidney disease, depending on the population studied, and also the uncertainty in the lifetime earnings benefit from avoided IQ reduction due to lead exposure. So you can see here the error bars plotted to give you an indication of the uncertainties of the costs and benefits. Now, clearly, as further evidence from trials and larger scale lead pipe replacement become available, we would expect that these uncertainties would reduce considerably. Now, more graphics such as these are available in the project report, but I'm going to go back now and focus on the headline results. So bringing together the nations of England and Wales together and comparing for each of them the all modelled policy scenarios at once. So this is a summary for England. And here we've plotted the benefit cost ratio for each policy implementation scenario, relative again, as always, to the reference scenario. So the key metric here is a benefit cost ratio of 1, which is plotted at the centre of this bar chart and shown by the thick black line. Above 1, policies are evaluated to be cost beneficial. Below 1, policies are expected to cost more than the value of the benefits they bring. On this chart, we show the two remediation outcomes based on the alternative views of lead and water concentration after lead pipe replacement, and that's again what we've called the conservative and optimistic remediation outcomes. So one way to think of these is if everything goes well with lead pipe replacement, you could expect a result at or close to the optimistic outcome shown by the blue bars here. However, if there are issues with the replacement program, you might find that lead concentration profiles following a replacement closer to the conservative scenario, which is based again on a small trial data set, and that's shown here in the red bars. But to draw our conclusions and to provide best estimates for evaluation, we've chosen to take the midpoint value between the conservative and optimistic outcomes, and these are indicated here by the thin vertical bars. Now, if you accept that this midpoint value is the best estimate, you can see that the lead pipe replacement to the kitchen tap is likely to be cost beneficial as a whole, but the lead pipe replacement up to the property wall cannot be recommended for some low-risk zones, as it wouldn't generate sufficient benefit in those zones to outweigh the costs of lead pipe replacement. Now, it's a different picture for Wales, and here again, because the baseline lead and water concentrations are on aggregate much lower than those for England, there is a smaller distance to travel in terms of minimising lead and water. And as such, the cumulative health benefits of doing so are reduced since, and I repeat, from our analysis, that the lead concentrations on average in water are already lower in Wales. Here, the choice of which remediation outcome is closer to reality really makes a difference. So following the example of England from the previous slide, we can say that on balance, taking a midpoint estimate between conservative and optimistic remediation outcomes leads us to conclude that lead pipe remediation to the kitchen tap for all high-risk zones is close to cost neutral. For medium and low-risk zones, we can definitely conclude that replacement up to the property wall does not confer enough health benefit, even under the optimistic remediation outcome. For these zones, lead pipe replacement to the kitchen tap is the only modelled scenario for which cost neutrality is even possible, and then only if the optimistic scenario is found to be true. Of course, we'll only know which lead pipe remediation outcome is closer to reality by carrying out larger scale lead pipe replacement, commencing in the high risk zones where benefits are believed to already outweigh costs. So, in summing up, even with further tweaks to upstream conditioning, the water industry cannot guarantee compliance with a future lead water quality standard of 5 micrograms per litre or better in all water supply zones. This research has demonstrated that in addition to the benefits of improved IQ in children up to age 10, there is also compelling evidence of health benefits for the adult population in terms of improved health outcomes for both cardiovascular and chronic kidney disease by reducing exposure to environmental lead. Lead pipe replacement to the property wall does not eliminate lead in drinking water, conveys reduced health benefits, and is less cost beneficial than lead pipe replacement up to the kitchen tap. Our best estimates of both costs and benefits suggest that lead pipe replacement to the kitchen tap is at least cost neutral in water supply zones at high risk of non-compliance, and cost neutral in most other zones in England. In Wales, we estimate that this policy option is broadly cost neutral overall, but only if the optimistic outcome is assumed to be true. And again, the main reason for the difference in cost benefit between Wales and England is that the baseline risk of lead non-compliance is already lower on average in Wales than in England. In other words, Wales is starting from a lower, more favourable baseline, and so the future expected benefits of lead pipe replacement are somewhat less overall. And finally, we look forward to the growth in the evidence base as further trials and larger scale lead pipe replacement is carried out. This will be hugely beneficial in reducing the remaining uncertainties and help shape implementation strategies at a local level in the years to come. Back to Carmen.
Lovely, thank you very much, Mark, and a huge amount of information there for everybody to take in. So please do keep sending your questions through. I can see quite a few come through already, particularly with regards to some methodology. So I'd like to invite now all four of our speakers, Milo, Mark, Joe and Robert, if you want to turn your cameras on so we can see you once again, and I will ask you some of these questions that are coming through. I'll also just like to let the audience know that when we do finish today's webinar, there will be a feedback survey that appears, and we'd really appreciate it if you could answer the questions. It will only take you a couple of minutes at the end. Right, so do we have, yes, we have 4 cameras on. Excellent, nice to see you all. I'll just give you a moment to recover from presenting, because yeah, you managed to cover a huge amount of information very quickly there. So first questions, let me just stop the screen so people can see you. So I'm going to try and put these into some sort of logical order for you. And a couple of people have asked in relation to a fundamental area, could you please just talk through a little bit more the criteria used to classify the high, medium and low risk zones that are sort of, you've mentioned several times throughout. So I think perhaps, is that Joe, is that your area? Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously I've got an awful lot of time in this presentation to go through the detail, but we essentially took lead compliance sample results data, an estimate of lead pipe prevalence in a zone, and also the level of P dosing applied at a zone, and use them to assign a high, medium or low risk value to each water supply zone. So for instance, if you had more than one sample above 3 micrograms per litre, then it would never be a low risk zone, but it would only be a high risk zone if then, I can't remember off the top of my head, but if it had a certain level of lead pipes in it, and also a certain level of mitigation in terms of the lead, the plumbo solvency value used. So that's how we applied the risk zones that way. I hope that clarifies.
Okay. Thank you. And I should also say to the audience, if we do ask your question and you'd like a little further detail, then just drop me a note and we'll always try and come back to you after the webinar to fill in those gaps.
There is a lot more detail in the report, obviously, around how we did that and how we came to those conclusions and those factors. Yeah. And
I suppose a question for Milo then, will this report be published on DWI's website? Will it be publicly available or circulated to the attendees?
Yes, it will be. Our usual process for putting research reports in the public domain is to publish them on our website. We have a policy of putting all R&D reports on the website, and this is in that category. We see this as a research report to try to provide information as a next step, building on what has been done already. And I think we should be able to put it up on our website reasonably soon. I would hope that it'll be up there shortly, possibly by the end of this week or maybe next week.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So we have a question from a couple of people, one from DWI and one, I think it's Yorkshire Water, that asks about the leakage benefit assumption that's made with regard to the service pipes. Joe, is that you again?
Yes, okay. I can't remember the details myself, but so we have assumed a so the economic tool that we used was based on the UK Word Plumo solvency spreadsheet that they built in 2012 that they kindly gave us permission to use. So within that, we're already built in a number of benefits that for lead pipe replacement, one of which was the leakage saving, and I believe it was a standard volumetric saving based on the number of pipes replaced. It was a straightforward count. I don't know whether any Mark or Robert can.
Yeah, that's correct. And in terms of we did uprate the cost of water produced as well from the latest service delivery report, Discover Water website, and water company's own TOTEX values for the last 4 financial years. So that gave us an update to the cost of water produced on average for England and for Wales.
Lovely.
A final change we made to the way it was originally coded in the UK WER spreadsheet is that the leakage savings were accrued from the point at which the pipe was replaced. So if we're replacing pipes over a 20-year period, then it takes that into account that not you won't get the leakage savings all at once at the beginning or at the end. You will start to accrue those benefits as the pipes are replaced.
Okay, yeah, lovely. Now we have again these questions seem to come in pairs. There's always 2 people who's asking each question, and so Fiona from Affinity Water has asked, do the predictions include controls such as banning lead-based solders and sale of low lead brasses for use in plumbing systems?
I'll take this one. They've gone. Why not? So no, not explicitly. It didn't. No. So one of the policy implementation, as Mark explained at the beginning of the presentation, was the replacement of the lead pipes. It wasn't to do with any future policies around banning lead solder for plumbing. That wasn't explicitly modelled.
So would that mean that potentially if there were additional policies in place that the overall benefits could be higher or lower?
It could be increased, yes. So I mean, there is evidence that solder is a source of lead. So yes, if you had policies in the future that included the ban of the use of those policies, then yes, you would get improvements in the future as well. But we didn't model that within this project.
Okay, lovely.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
No, please.
I I just wonder if I could add to that, and that is that we are liaising with various bodies to see if we can bring forward developments in policy in this area, because it's an absolutely valid question. It's something that's been a worry for a long time. Not just solders, there are other issues with nickel and chromium, as people will know from taps and what have you. We're having some discussions with RAS about some of those matters, and we'd like to follow up on those, and also with policymakers to see what might be possible by way of guidance, advice, and even stronger action at the point of sale. Over to you, Mark.
I'm just going to say there's some recent research which suggests the proportion of lead which might be coming from internal plumbing relative to that of the service pipe outdoors, and it seems to point to around 3/4 from the outdoor part of the pipe, and potentially up to 1/4 or thereabouts from the internal plumbing. But that there's not so many studies which give estimates for that sort of proportion. Clearly, there's going to be widespread variation from property to property, but that gives you a sense of the scale of the issue for internal plumbing potentially, which is why we're keen to include the element up to the kitchen tap, or the compliance point at least, in this analysis.
Thank you. John Haley has asked, was any evaluation made of the benefits of lead pipe replacement to all points within a premises to pick up all possible points of consumption, I guess, as opposed to just the kitchen tap?
So we considered the costs on of doing so, and we reflected with the wider project team on the huge and hugely variable costs that would incur to the householder potentially. So we had removed that as a feasible option, which would to make the economic valuation, let's say, manageable within the project. Clearly, we could have estimated that cost, but it's got a huge uncertainty attached to it, and we just didn't think the disruption that potentially involved was going to be manageable as a policy, and could make the policy very difficult to implement.
Thank you. And if we look over on the cost side now in relation to lead pipe replacement, we've been asked by Claire Pollard, what unit cost did you use? Because you mentioned that there was a lot of variation in it. So what was the data source, please?
So we had a blended rate. So we used information published information from water company business plans, and came up with a unit rate from that, supported by some cost information that we had at our disposal. Companies are very cautious or shy about sharing cost data, so we use, and I want to add to that, Mark, but there was specifically looking at business plans that looked at a more proactive lead policy going forward in this current AMP. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. So we looked at a range of rates, including off-what benchmarks at PR19, and the figures we've used are £2,000 for the average service pipe to the property wall, and £2,750 to the compliance point, with other rates for the supply pipe only, £1,580, and £1,000 as a rate for the communication pipe only. And again, those are based on a mix of client data points, off-what benchmarks, but also include we're allowed for sensitivity around those unit costs, which we've already explained. So those are the central estimate figures we've used in the valuation.
Thank you. And so would those costs include the cost of aborted excavations? Would they wrap up all of the effort needed to eventually deliver a successful replacement, do you think?
So they would have included management supervision materials. Aborted costs, well, I think that would come down to individual companies, what they publish, what they included in their determinations, actually. But perhaps as an aside to that, we have to acknowledge that we know that configurations and common supplies do make service pipes a challenging thing to replace and address. We didn't have the ability or the data of evidence available to really have a whole almost rate card of costs for that, particularly as we were looking at this at a water supply zone level. We use that mid-range and envelope values to try and account for those differences in configurations at a property level. So within the supply zone, you'd expect to have some straightforward ones as well as some complex ones, but overall there would be that typical cost or average cost. That's not quite the word I want to use, but that typical cost for replacing the supply pipe, service pipe, apologies. So the internal cost, I should also add, was based on insurance company information. So that uplift for doing the bit that goes from the wall of the property to the tap was taken as from insurance company information that we had available to us.
Lovely, thank you. And
Carmen, could I add a couple of points to this as well? I think the team has done their best to come up with something which is realistic based on the best available information, and we think it's a fair cost to reflect for what it is we're trying to do. But in the pilots that we did some 15-20 years ago, some people on the call may remember that DWI sponsored some pilot studies for pipe removal back in the day, and there were a number of factors which led to some controversy around the unit rates involved, and they were all about configuration, as Joe has mentioned, in terms of length, but also in terms of complexity, the situation in certain locations, such as with terraced housing in some urban areas with shared services. There were all sorts of complications around that. There were complications around the nature of stringers and the like, and also with street furniture and trees and access generally. And at that time, my recollection, and I'm open to correction, is that we had a significant range of costs from under £200 to over 800. And companies at the time included different costs within those estimates. I think this is an area that needs attention during the AMP7 period, and it's one on which we'd like to put some attention to in our discussions with the Water UK policy group, policy board and strategy group, which have been recently set up, and we're delighted by that. But some of these practical issues will need to be addressed. And I think it's also the case that there isn't a single unit cost within a company. It varies, particularly in bigger companies, enormously from urban to rural areas, from small town to big town, to suburban areas to city centre areas. And I think we need to consider the implications of some of that, together with the identification of what might be the high-risk areas. And there's a lot of modelling yet to be done. We see this as very much the first step in providing information to move forward from and use in the development of more, if you like, granular work to try to identify more realistic costs on a company basis. And I think we recognize, and I hope people recognize the fact that, as I said it right at the beginning, this work is research work that is done with a view to developing the debate and providing a basis for policy making and legislative change. What happens on the ground is another matter altogether, and I think we will need to look at that very carefully.
Thank you for those comments. So sticking with the theme of the sort of replacement part of the process, we've a couple of related questions. So firstly, Joanna from I think from DWI asks, did the review for replacement with polyethylene look at whether barrier pipe could be used to provide added benefit from hydrocarbon contamination in the soil? Did we go anywhere outside of just thinking about lead benefits?
No, we didn't consider hydrocarbons. No, we just looked at the lead benefit.
Okay.
Yeah, we made a decision, right? Sorry, Jo, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Carry on.
My recollection is that in the steering group, we made a decision right at the beginning to rule that out because of the relatively small impact it would have on the overall picture, but the quite disproportionate cost of putting in a barrier pipe in terms of whatever assumptions we made about the scale of it. So I think that's realistic, and that's saying that I fully acknowledge that DWI and water companies have to deal with hydrocarbon problems on a daily basis almost. But even so, in terms of what it is we're addressing here, it isn't probably a significant factor in the overall picture that we were seeking to develop.
And Bob from Portsmouth Water has asked, did lead pipe relining or other methods of rehabilitation be considered at all?
Mark, you touched on this at the beginning with your
Yes, yeah. I mean, essentially, we did look at that. I think that the key decision for us was thinking about the longevity of the benefits and working on a 60-year planning horizon. I don't know of any lining solution that's going to last that long, and I'm happy to be corrected if people know otherwise. But we felt that we couldn't guarantee the enduring benefits with a lining solution. So we recognise there is a shorter term improvement from those solutions, but we were making assumptions, perhaps larger assumptions that we've made so far on the rest of this project around the longevity of individual lining solutions and the known difficulties site by site, where in some cases those solutions have not successfully remediated lead. So we just felt that was a too big a risk to try and quantify, and because we could not guarantee a successful outcome over the life of the horizon we were modelling, we chose to rule out lining as a long-term solution.
Thank you.
I'll just add, so a replacement meant general replacement. We didn't specify open cut, molding, pipe pulling, or anything like that. Kind of building on what Milo said, this is a blended general cost for replacing the lead pipes.
Lovely, thank you. And actually, there's a couple of sort of small little clarification points here. So Paul has asked, could you just confirm, does to the wall cost mean to the outside wall or to the internal stop tap?
To the wall means to the outside property wall. To the compliance point means that little bit that goes from the outside of the property into normally the kitchen tap, the first point of where the sample's taken from.
Brilliant, thank you. Now we've had a question come through, lifting us back out of the detail for a moment, about the process with regard to publishing or producing this research, peer reviewing and publishing. So are you able to confirm, is the report, or how has the report been peer reviewed? And I thought maybe it might be an opportunity just to acknowledge all of the different people who contributed, through work on the steering group and the different experts who were called upon to support this. So I don't know whether, Milo, you want to take that first in terms of the process?
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, I'll leave it to my colleagues to deal with the question of peer review, because I think it was Mark who mentioned a number of peer review exercises. But yes, on the steering group, we did have a range of people. We had some policy colleagues, we had economists from DEFRA, we had 2 colleagues from the public health side, as well as colleagues from DWI, and we sought advice from different people, and we were externally. We also were very grateful for the support of water companies who provided information to us, and that wasn't a straightforward task for some of them, but it was exceptionally helpful, and obviously we couldn't have done the exercise without their help. We also got the agreement of John Haley and others in interfacing with UCWIA, and they provided us with some of the modelling work that they had completed previously, that I think it was Joe referred to just now. So there were a lot of people who contributed to this, and I have to say that I admire the persistence of my WRC colleagues in dealing with the frustrations that they had to endure from me and from others on the group, who asked them to look at things continuously and to re-examine something and to perhaps delay them at times, which occurred on a regular basis. But the other thing that I need to do is to acknowledge the role of the project manager from DWI, Frank White, who did a fantastic job in trying to pull things together and keep things on track, and supported by Pete Morriston, who leads our R&D effort. But perhaps I could go to Mark or Robert or Joe for details of the more technical peer review issues.
Yeah, so I'll start, and Jill, Robert, if I forget something, just chip in. So in terms of internal peer review, I've acknowledged the support and independence of a health economist, Richard de Burgh, and also water industry economist Caroline Manning, who supported and helped us work through the development of the wider economic framework. It's important to recognise as well that we're fortunate at WRC. We have our own toxicology team who know quite a lot about lead from a public health perspective, and so they independently assessed the quality of evidence and our conclusions from that evidence before we released the reports for review externally. So we had if you like, a Chinese wall set up within the project team WRC, so that we could do that internal review before we submitted it externally.
Lovely, thank you. So lots of different people, lots of different specialisms have been involved in developing this work. Okay, we've got some questions now. Going back to some of the detail, I'm afraid. And Robert, I'm wondering if this is one for you. The question is from Tom, and he asks, how is earnings loss linked to IQ benefit. How is that estimated?
Yes, the central value we used, I believe, was 1.5% per full IQ point. If I will get the source of that study for you.
Okay, lovely. So there is a study, and Robert is probably desperately looking through the report now to confirm the name of it. So I'm sure he'll come back in a moment. Perhaps Mark or Joe, we have a question from Carol that says deprivation is known to be significant in vulnerability to lead, and was that taken into account?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not explicitly, but there is a huge overlap between the health outcomes in the population relating to cardiovascular disease and chronic kidney disease and deprivation. So to avoid significant double counting, we focused on the baseline health outcomes of CVD and CKD and tracked those through the population, rather than try and use the deprivation index as an independent variable, if you like. Very technical answer there, sorry, but that's how we approached it. We did look at using deprivation indices as an alternative to the health endpoints, but we chose to work through those health outcomes instead, which, as I said, are closely linked to deprivation in many ways.
I can come back in on the IQ point there. So the value we used was from a DWI study conducted by WRC in 1997. We were aware of that study, but independent of that, asked our external economist to conduct a full literature review of developments since that point. And he concluded that there has been no significant additions to the literature since that point, and that remains the most up-to-date and best value to use.
Well, just to add to that, we have allowed a 0.5% sensitivity on that number in our benefits assumptions. So the uncertainty analysis allows for that 1.5 plus or minus 0.5% in terms of lifetime earnings per IQ point.
And I'm sure our audience is getting an understanding here of quite how detailed all of this analysis has gone to. And a couple of people have asked to confirm, are all of these assumptions and costs and unit values listed in the report?
That's an easy one, yes.
I'm glad I could ask one easy question on behalf of the audience here, but I thought we'd just confirm that. So yes, so everybody.
It's thorough. I will say that. I hope they all are. I believe they all are. Yeah. It's 120 pages of appendices will tell you that it's probably got everything in it. So.
Yeah, all the references are listed and everything that we've used have been cited. The literature review for the health endpoints in particular is listed in the appendices as well. So yeah,
a great reference source for many other studies, I'm sure. On a slightly different topic, Paul has asked, are you including benefits of avoiding environmental damage of eutrophication and other impacts that were identified in previous work on private water supply pipe ownership?
It's a good question. No, we're not. And there has been some discussion around the costs and benefits from previous work to wastewater treatment as well, more generally. And those are, because of the wide variation catchment to catchment, those are not included in our valuation, although they are available for use in the Aqua Plumber Solvency tool. But they're, in some extent, the reduction in phosphate load and the requirement for managing copper at wastewater treatment works. To some extent, one compensates for the other. So there's, from a materiality perspective and from the variation from catchment to catchment, we've chosen not to explicitly model those in this study. So that's they're not, and it's definitely something that could be done, as with other social costs as well, which we've considered, and at present not valued because of the wide uncertainty that would add to the results.
Thank you.
Carmen, could I add a couple of points to that as well?
Of course.
The other things, I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff that we chose to not try to quantify, and we've told it pretty straight, I think. So, for example, we haven't tried to, beyond the work that had already been done on leakage, we haven't tried to do anything smart with interpreting what possible synergies there might be between government policy drivers at the moment on metering and on leakage. And as you know, there's a debate at the moment about the potential benefits from the synergies that would go into integrated programs of lead pipe replacement, leakage, metering, and real-time data monitoring and all of that side of things. So we haven't tried to gain the benefits of any of that side. In addition, there's in a different context, issues around the constraints that current operational practice places on the development of provision of bulk supplies, water transfers, and water grids. There's a very real issue around water transfers that disrupt current lead plumber solvency measures. And it could be the case in certain scenarios developing in the regional water resource groups, as well as for the water resource management plans for PR 2024, that water grids may become a greater feature. And as you know, DWI has very great concerns about the impact this has on the stability of the plumber solvency measures and orthophosphate dosing in particular, when systems are disrupted by flows that perhaps are not optimized to the same extent. Now, obviously, we have information that indicates that it's a certain amount of disruption can be tolerated, but the scale of the potential gains that there might be for resilience of networks have not been factored into this, and that is potentially a very big issue in terms of the overall resilience of water supplies going forward. Up to now, DWI has not asked for companies monitoring of changing supply arrangements due to the use of grids or transfers to demonstrate that they continue to optimize the conditioning of water at the tap. Going forward, it may be that we need to do that. And the constraints that would place on operational practice would be severe indeed. So we haven't taken account of any of the enormous benefits that would come from a reduction in the use of orthophosphate, which would free up some of the water supply integration and resilience benefits in this work. But there are a number of other similar unseen issues, such as not just eutrophication, but there are other issues around leakage and the suggestion that there might be contamination of groundwaters, etc. We have not tried to quantify the benefits from changing policy that changing policy would bring to those situations, and those are, you know, not insignificant if we did actually try to attempt to quantify them.
So just to add to that, thank you, Miles. Just to add, as we said earlier, obviously we've attempted to model the direct cost of leakage of water of savings from leakage, but not the efficiency gain from doing a leakage and lead replacement policy as one. And we have attempted to model the benefit in terms of avoided plumber solvency costs, but in a very cautious way, making sure that that action is not taken on that until all the lead pipes are removed from a particular zone, and only then reducing the P-dosing stepwise, cautiously, bit by bit, over the following 10 years. So as a development from the existing plumber solvency tool, we haven't assumed that you could switch off all P-dosing as soon as all lead pipes were removed, because the water chemistry doesn't allow you to do that safely. So we've taken a more cautious approach to the benefits there, as I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Now we've got a couple of questions related to my favourite topic, people, and these sort of linked together to me. So the first one was, did the research include any engagement with general public or water users at all?
Not as a primary reason for this research. We've obviously looked at consumer studies in the literature, but we haven't engaged consumers from a primary data gathering perspective, no.
Okay, thank you. And then John asks, did the research project assess or consider the willingness of property owners for the customer section of the service pipe to be replaced? So he comments that certain groups of customers may not want the disruption, which would leave a small number of lead pipes in the water supply zone.
Okay, so that is a really good point. And for the reference scenario, we did assume a very small uptake rate for the supply pipe replacement based on the kind of uptake rate that you're seeing now as an industry. For the other scenarios whereby the whole service pipe was replaced either to the wall or to the internal tap, we have assumed that if it needs to be replaced, it would be replaced. We haven't made any comments about ownership or adoption or anything like that. The assumption is that it will be replaced. We haven't modelled the mechanism by which that would happen. So we're aware that, yes, there are different groups of people that will allow the water company to replace the pipes and others that won't. We haven't made any modelled or made any assumption about how that would actually happen. I don't know whether, Mark, you want to add to that at all?
No, not really, Joe. That's exactly what I was going to say as well. Yeah, so looking at trying to estimate the uptake rate for a wholesale replacement. Again, they could be done as a sensitivity analysis, but we wouldn't be clear exactly where to start with that, if I'm honest, and therefore we chose not to do that. And part of the costs involved in looking at replacement would also be a significant amount of consumer engagement would be required. That's obvious. But I don't know whether Milo, you wanted to add anything to that.
I agree completely with the points you make and you both make. I would just add that it was deliberate in many respects, because what we wanted to do was to focus on presenting, a particular approach, and to use it as a means of informing the potential for policy change in respect of the ownership of the service pipes. And one of the reasons for including DEFRA economists and others was to identify the sorts of things that might be valuable to policymakers and economist advisors and legal advisors if they came to change policy, and in the development of an impact assessment, which had to go before the RPC and others in Whitehall and in Cardiff. In particular, I think it's very important that we set out you know, a fairly I know it might sound odd, but because it's been incredibly complex to get this far, but in many respects, it's a fairly basic presentation of scenarios. And in the context of changing policy, I think that's probably where we've needed to pitch it. We haven't tried to quantify or monetize the benefits or costs of consumer uptake. The general story in terms of consumer uptake is a disappointing one, even when grants have been provided. And we haven't sought to explore the area of grants or other approaches to managing costs. That's more a policy issue. We did have some experience of the work of the Public Health Partnership in Wales, who engaged with a number of government departments in the trials which looked at what would be required for rolling out different approaches to dealing with lead, and the complexity of engaging with communities and housing and other departments quickly became apparent. So I think we've tried to, even though the report is very complex, in many respects, we have tried to keep it relatively simple at a policy level so that we can give policymakers realistic scenarios that are properly and defensively monetized to go into the justification of need for policy change.
Thank you. Now, Milo, whilst you're busy thinking there's a couple of questions that I think you might be able to help us out with.
Sure.
And the first is from Julie from RAS, who says, when companies put together their AMP7 programs, do the DWI expect them to consider the sort of training and experience of installers?
Yes, we expect competent operators who have been properly assessed and who have blue cards and who have been adequately trained through a EUS process or others, and who are aware of the plumbing requirements that go hand in hand with the water safe good practice schemes. Those are the minimum expectations, and they extend to self-lay contractors as much as to anybody else. And many people will know that the National Water Hygiene Group has done a lot of work recently to try to persuade companies to, shall we say, take a step forward in the way in which they manage the appropriate training and certification of self-lay contractors. But that's an aside. I think the general point is that yes, we assume the best, because I'm sure that companies wouldn't want it to be any differently. That's not to say there aren't problems. We have events from time to time where good practice breaks down when when you've got a chain of command from tier 1 contractors to tier 3, who then go on to subcontractors who further subcontract, and the audit trail on following the water company good practice is a difficult one to trail. We're looking into a few of these, but the overall point is a good one. We expect those who work on water systems and who have the potential to cause public health injury through malpractice, we expect those possibilities to be limited by the good practice of water companies and their good procedures in place.
Thank you. So I've got two last questions, and one is a broad one for anyone on the panel, and the other is probably another Milo one. So first of all, the broad one. Rachel from Scottish Water, I think, has asked, what are the speakers' thoughts about using average conditions across a country compared with using target demographic groups, e.g. a young family? I think this comes back to the benefits and costs going into the modelling. Don't know if Robert or Mark, either of you want to.
There's a few answers to this question, so I'll start with one of them. So we've taken a water supply zone view because the current methods of compliance and are based on a water supply zone risk-based view. And that's why we've echoed that approach to both quantify what a high risk zone means, and also how to scale to the national level from that position. And that's required us to do a lot of matching of property and population data to the water supply zone through postcode information, essentially supplied by water companies, to allow us to do that scaling up. So your question relates to, should we be targeting different groups? And there is evidence from the health literature to suggest that particular ethnicities and particular subgroups population are more vulnerable to the effects of lead exposure for some health outcomes. We do reflect that in the valuation within the report. So we do look at those the subgroups of adults, for example, including those from particular subpopulations, and reflect those differing benefits in our summation to national level. We didn't have time to go through it in detail today, but there is that distinction in the report. Robert, I don't know if you want to add any comments to that.
No, I think that's the key point, that we did try to consider the different vulnerabilities of population groups and the relative prevalence of those by the spatial cohorting that we did, and the same with the lead prevalence, that we tried to apply that housing data as locally as we could to get a sense of the spatial variations. But when you're summing up to give the picture for the nation as a whole, you do not need to isolate a single household and say what lead concentration that household is going to receive and how vulnerable the people are living in that house. As long as we got the numbers, the relative vulnerabilities, and the apportioning correct, we are able to conduct the analysis at a water supply zone and then a national level in order to get the correct picture for the country as a whole.
Carmen, could I add a couple of points to that?
Of course.
I think it was absolutely essential, and WRC have been really rigorous in this, in sticking to the evidence and the evidential base to justify what is in the report, and you know, that has to be the way it is in a report of this nature. However, in the discussions that are coming up over the next 2 or 3 years, I think that we have an opportunity through the Water UK-led project board and other means. And I mention the project board particularly because I know that there are representatives from all over the UK on the board, together with multidisciplinary interests, and we're extremely grateful also to have the input of health colleagues again on that project board. But I think there's scope to look at all of the factors that might go into the practical decision making that decides where work needs to be done and how high risk areas might be defined. So it's been done in a very scientific way in this report, but as you know, DWI has been involved in long-term, large-scale national projects in the past that have taken delivery over a period of many years. And there are a number of factors that need to be taken account in the delivery of large programs of work. And there are practical issues that come into play. In particular, the practicalities of procurement and delivery on the ground. One of the things that we need to do is identify areas where it's practical to work. And I say that knowing that some local authorities have a reputation of being less than helpful in actually enabling the closure of streets, for example. We have practical experience of these issues. There are other areas where there's a high proportion and density of perhaps younger families. There are all sorts of reasons of packaging work for procurement requirements that might lend itself better to delivery. And I think we need to have focus on the need for delivery down the line. And when we get to that stage, I think there's scope for discussion to take account of a lot of other issues at that stage. And that isn't taking anything from this report. I hope you understand I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that at a later stage, when we're defining high-risk areas and when we're then redefining the areas in which work is to be carried out and where quick wins are necessary. And don't forget, over the time period of this project, assuming it goes forward, we're likely to have another possibly half a dozen or 8 secretaries of state in DEFRA, and there'll be similar turnover in the Welsh Government in Cardiff. All of them require quick wins. We've got to manage that. We've also got to manage the demonstration of benefit in terms of outputs so that we can continue to maintain financial streams of funding. Financial provision is really important. When we rolled out 20-year programs for the networks to deal with discoloration, we had to address all of these issues, and that meant coming up with methodologies and frameworks to maintain a consistent approach to both justify prioritizing work and where it needs to be done, but also measuring the outputs to demonstrate the benefits accruing, so that at each stage, no matter which minister is in post or whatever stage of the economic cycle in terms of periodic reviews it's at, we can guarantee that the policy will be applied consistently going forward across all shades of government and also all scenarios of potential financial provision considerations. So, you know, there's a lot of scope for discussion of some of these things as we go forward, which is completely separate from and additional to the foundation that is in this report. We have to start with this solid foundation before we even begin to think of some of these other practical issues.
Thank you. And I should also say we've had several lovely comments come through from the audience with regard to this being a very useful presentation. So thank you, panel. And I probably can't say it better than Michelle Ashford, who says, great presentation, an excellent springboard for addressing a societal problem, which I think is probably the point that we just tried to make quite eloquently put there. So Milo, I know you wish to make some concluding remarks, and we did have one last question, and perhaps you can pick this up within your remarks. And it was really a comment or a question with regard to the scale of health benefit from lead pipes as opposed to other sources of lead that people may be exposed to, and whether or not this is the most important place to address lead as a sort of health issue. So I don't know if you can pick that up as you make your concluding remarks now. Thank you.
In direct answer to the question, I think Mark actually made a point about this in the presentation, and there's some detail in the report about sources of lead and the various degrees of impact on humans who come in contact with lead from different sources, from dust or from soil or from water or from other sources. And I think perhaps the best way for me to answer the question is to provide maybe a reference to that section of the report. Sorry, I'm ducking the issue there, but I think Mark covered it in his presentation. But it is a absolutely valid question, and it's one that will need to be covered as we take this forward, both with policymakers, but also with consumer representatives who will want to be assured that they are getting value for money. And that brings me to maybe the last point I would make in general terms, and that is that what we haven't tried to do in this report is to go into the area of public benefits and the quantification and monetization of those benefits and the values that accrue, the public values that accrue for in terms of efficient delivery. But everybody will know who's on the call that this is a developing area with a very strong guide from policymakers, including recent statements from the National Infrastructure Commission and from Her Majesty's Treasury, to the effect that public policy going forward has to look at the public benefits that accrue from infrastructure work. And if ever there was an area where public benefit and public value plays strongly into the promotion of work, then surely it's got to be in this area where there are measurable, there's measurable detriment to public health, and even to our surprise, it was greater in some areas than we expected. So I think that area of public benefit and public value and the synergies to be gained by integrated programs in long-term planning is an area that we can go on to discuss through the project board and in other areas going forward. But in closure, I just, conscious of the time, I just want to say a huge thanks to my three colleagues and their colleagues from WRC. They've put a huge amount of effort into this report in some difficult circumstances at times, and they had some very difficult challenges from all members of the steering group. And I believe this is a really useful foundation for doing things going forward. And going forward, what I would suggest is that perhaps we could maybe review the report with colleagues from water companies and other stakeholders when we meet again at the Water UK LED Project Board. And it'd be interesting to get considered feedback when you've had a chance to look at the detail. I think there's a lot of work to be done during the AMP7 period to begin to better understand some of the costs involved, as has been highlighted in the discussion. I mentioned that the report will be available, and we will obviously welcome comments on the report and look to see how we might best bring it forward and use it. It could be the case that the report itself, in terms of its methodology, will be of enormous benefit to individual companies as they draw up their own programs of work on a prioritized basis. So I think we've got the foundations for something special here to actually move forward this issue and do something realistically do something about it over the next 20 years. So thank you for all dialing in, really appreciate it, and I hope that you continue to support the efforts of the industry to look at the value of protecting public health as we go forward in this area and in others. Thank you. Back to you, Carmen.
Lovely, thank you. Well, thank you to all our audience today. If you had questions which we didn't get to, I will ensure that all your questions and comments are passed on to the team. And as a reminder, after I close this webinar down, there will be a short feedback survey, which would be very grateful if you could complete. If you'd like to get hold of one of us, then I think you have an email address from the webinar invitation, or you can find us at WRC, find us on Teams, or give us a call, and we'd be very happy to talk to you about what this research might mean for you and your policies. Okay, I'm going to end the webinar now. Please fill in the survey, and thank you again for attending, and thank you to all of our panelists and Milo for speaking. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.